Joined in 2005. I wanted to join the Marine Corps. That's what I wanted, because that's like pride of, the whole thing, the uniform, and my family was like, yeah, the Marines. If you're gonna do anything, do the Marines. And they didn't know anything about the Army, the Navy, anything else, right? So the Marines was the go-to. And then I was like, you know what? I tried for the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps had a really strict policy with tattoos, and that's where the tattoo conversation came in, about a neck tattoo on my back. And it's I had to get that removed. I got it removed, and they were still like, no, we still can't take you because, something else popped up.
This
I was
was
like,
a gang-affiliated tattoo?
yeah. And so later on, I walked over to the Army dudes, and I was like, hey, I started the process with these dudes. They're like, oh, sweet, your paperwork's pretty much all done. Awesome. Let's just see the little things. And then so waivers were written up, and then they were like, cool, we could take you for this, start your process. Next thing I knew, 2 months later, I was on a bus going to basic training.
When did you know you wanted to serve?
Man, that's a great question. I don't think I've thought of it like that. I think I probably knew as a kid. I knew that I wanted to do cool shit with guns, is like I describe it, right? I wanted to do cool stuff with guns.
It seems like every stage of your life, there's been guns involved.
Yeah. From the moment I could play with them to the very first G.I. Joes that came with guns, there was some sort of attraction to it. And it wasn't in a malicious way. I knew that they were force multipliers. I knew we used them for good. And I did grow up with, and I'm sure you did as well, with like the hero stories, right? The King Arthurs, the Batmans, all the stories that want little people growing up, young men, to grow up and be like, oh, I want to be the hero of this story one day, maybe my story, right? Whatever the case. So those were all part of growing up. So having guns with G.I. Joes, having guns with Nerf wars, having guns with water guns. Only our water gun fights, this is another cool young story, is when we would run up on other people that weren't our friends, we would put bleach in our water guns.
Oh, man.
And we would bleach the shit out of people with
Bleach
just
straight
straight
face?
bleach to the
Oh,
face,
wow.
straight to the body, in the mouth. Like, it was gnarly growing up. Like I said, it's just things you do. I look back now and I'm like, man, I should have not been that bad, but it's all part of the cool story.
That's another level of savagery. So what were some, I know that we just went from a nice little joking environment, but I've been obsessed with the Iraq War for the last year and a half, learning about it, because when I was younger, so I'm 24 years old. When I was younger, didn't care, to be honest with you. I was too busy playing video games, playing basketball, going to college, going to school. Now that I have this time in my hands and I realize that my ethnic roots are like embedded in Iraq, that's when I started to care more about the history and what happened. And so speaking to people who have their feet on the ground there and understanding their perspectives is very important to me now. So one thing I like to ask people, and I think this is a good opportunity to ask you since you were there, what were some disturbing things you saw during your time when you were deployed?
Yeah, that did take a twist, didn't it? So the people there weren't from there. Does that make sense? The people we were fighting were insurgents from other places. So this was a hard one for us too, because and what's funny is they look like you, they look like me. Like I look like I fit in Iraq when I was there. Yeah. And so I'll paint a bigger picture so it makes more sense. The local community, have you been to Mexico?
Yeah.
Have you been to Iraq and that area?
I've been to Jordan and Lebanon.
Okay. Similar stuff, right? Like wrought iron fences, a lot of pastel colors everywhere, right? Like the pinks, the blues, the neon, almost like pinks. They pick these colors that are very bright and flamboyant. So if you've seen how Mexico has these houses and these colors, it was very similar in Iraq. So for me, it was almost like I was visiting my hometowns in Mexico, and the people look like me, and full beards and mustaches. The clothing was obviously different. The food is different, The culture is a little bit different, but the environment looked the same. Dirt roads, some cobblestone roads, some paved roads, a lot of canals. Mexico's got the same thing in the farming communities, right? And then these colors, and then these steel rod fences everywhere, wrought iron gates that open to the garages, right, to drive into the houses. So it's very similar to that. So it didn't feel foreign, for me at least, because I had been to some places that look like that, desert-like, right? And so while we were there, we got to know a lot of the local people who were actually from there, and a lot of their grievances were that these people that we were fighting, that we were destroying locals' homes, locals' villages, locals' stores, and roads that they use every day, was because of people that weren't even from there. right? And that was a hard thing for us to grasp, because the way we were trained was like, go, and if they're not in uniform, they're probably the enemy. And we're like, oh man, everyone's the enemy. And it wasn't the case, right? Obviously, a lot of the local people were friendly. They did want some sort of resemblance of peace for their community. But it was gruesome in the sense that what the insurgent dudes did to the locals to create loyalty through violence, right? Cutting people's hands, taking kids from people. A lot of the stuff that we see even now in the Middle East was being done there. It's a habit-forming thing that those groups do.
Yeah.
And they weren't even Iraqi. They weren't even Babylonian people, the guys that were there fighting against us.
There's a lot of that Afghani and Pakistani. By the way, thank you for your service. I forgot to mention that in the beginning.
Yeah, it was one of the best things I could have done. And this country has given my family a lot, and it was the right thing to do, is to give back. So
Absolutely. I know a lot of guys, when they come back, their perspective in life has absolutely shifted. And so you hear stories about the traumatic experiences people have, the suicide rates that a lot of, especially the Iraq war, that skyrocketed. We'll get into that specifically a little bit later on. Is there anything from your time while serving in the Middle East that eats away or haunts at you till this day, or maybe you've worked through it, but is there anything that did eat away at you when you were deployed there?
I mean, a lot of the survivor's guilt that everyone goes through, like, you know, why me? Why did they die? Like, our people. Nothing that like breaks the normalcy of life. It's just things you've learned to internalize, right, in life. And I think the early childhood exposure to violence made it easier for this exposure to violence to be a part of something that I could deal with, right?
So do you think that a person with I'll just use this for simplicity's sake, a troubled youth or a violent youth would have an easier time joining the military than a person who, let's say, grew up in a typical white collar home where they had the family nucleus?
Yes and no. I think it's a personality trait, to be honest.
More so than anything else?
Yeah, and people carry it in all walks of life. You can be super chill, happy-go-lucky kid in the suburbs, and the leadership finds a way to pop and let it out, let that personality trait out. And that's what the military is really great about. And looking back at it now, it's like all of the programming, all of the yelling, all of the lessons were so that they could tap into the psyche and bring that out of people. And then the military does a great job of funneling people where they belong. So if you're good for combat, they'll put you in combat roles. If you're good at doing mechanical stuff, you're going to go do mechanical stuff, right? And I think people have this trait in them or they don't. And it's easier for people to cope with the traumas if they have that personality trait. A great example would be some of the guys that we deployed with were younger, and they came from easier backgrounds, let's just say, and they became more addicted to narcotics afterwards, and their PTSD was different, right? Where, so one of the big ones for me, and my wife laughs about this all the time, not in like laughing at you, making fun of you way, but she knows, like, the moment I start a grill and I throw steaks on the grill, I have a moment in time where I just stop and I look, I take a big deep breath, I smell the meat cooking, and I remember one of our crazy incidents that we had in Iraq where we had to recover the body of one of our soldiers that burned alive inside of a vehicle. And the smell of human meat is the smell as meat we cook now. So whenever I'm at barbecues or anything, and it's kind of weird, I guess, but I take a deep breath, I smell it, I remember, I honor the memory by remembering, and then I go right back to living life. It
never like turned you off from eating that food again, never made you be like, I can't eat this anymore?
No, it troubled me at first. I remember the very first time I realized that was going to be a thing that I lived with was a family barbecue at my dad's house in Chicago. And all we do is grill meat, right? It's a Mexican thing. Maybe it's an Assyrian thing too.
Yeah,
right?
Carnivore.
And I'm sitting there and I'm in the corner and I didn't talk to anybody for like an hour and a half. And I was just watching him cook meat and the meat roasting and I could smell it. And I'm just like, man, all right, this is a thing. Like, I'm going to have to deal with this for a long time if I want to continue to live a normal life, right?
So human meat smells the same as regular meat?
Most meat smells the same.
Wow.
Yeah. So
how long was it from when you had that traumatic experience versus that cookout at your dad's house? What was the time difference between them?
Probably like 2 years.
Okay, pretty recent.
Yeah, it was fresh. You don't really learn about what troubles you till about 3 to 5 years post.
Why do you think that is?
Because there's so much happening, right? So there's so much happening that the brain only has so much of a capacity to process things. And now I'm on to processing new things. An example is this. They give me a map and they're like, hey, we're going to be working in this area of southern Baghdad. Cool, you're studying the map. And then they're like, hey, we're going to be on the west side of Baghdad now. You have to like, oh man, all this information that I learned, I need to put it away and start studying the other map. And then they're like, hey, we're going to be moving through these routes, learn these roads. So now you got to put that away and then learn the roads and the routes going the other direction. So that's how I think trauma gets stacked. The more trauma you get, you have to put it back and deal with the upcoming things first, and then stack that trauma until you can come back to it at a later time and start dealing with it. And I truly do believe that holding things in is a better way. It's controversial, right? Everyone's like, talk about your feelings, talk about all this. If you talk about them at the wrong time with the wrong people, you'll relive the trauma with no closure. So you're just hurting yourself, right?
It goes back to the original conversation we had about you trusting certain people, where it can come back to bite you in the ass. You know, it's actually funny you say that. One of my last questions, I can bring it up now since you brought it up. As a man in today's society, you know, you've spoken about mental health publicly as well. You've been through things, you've seen some things, you've had people lost in your life. And so how do you, 80% of people don't care you have problems. 20% are glad that you have those issues. So how do you decide when to talk about it? Who to talk about it with? Who can you trust? How do you pick those people in your life to talk about instances?
So I generalize a lot. I say it more for me than I do for others. So when I say certain things or I post publicly about things, I was laughing this morning about people unfollowing me because I posted something about Christians. Yeah. But I say things and I generalize them I'm not seeking validation or wanting people to feel badly for me or sympathy or anything. I'm just saying it out loud. What it is I'm now ready to process those emotions. So my early podcast that I've ever done, I probably didn't talk about the roasted meat, the grilling meat, right? I wasn't ready for it. I think the first time I truly openly acknowledged that conversation was with Ed from Ed's Manifesto a while back. And I was like, you know what? I'm ready to just let that one be. Like, let that be a thing. And it's not for people to be like, oh, I've been there, man. I feel you. Like, I don't. And again, 20% don't care, right? Or 20% are glad, right? 80% don't care.
Yeah.
And so if people don't care, it's less about wanting them to care and more about just letting it be so that you know what I've been through. So it's a moment of vulnerability because now people can attack that. But if you want to attack that, man, you have worse problems, I think. And to me, you're not a formidable adversary.
I will also, you know, the risk of putting it out into the wild ecosystem that is the internet. Like, you know, you're exposing yourself. You're making that conscientious decision. But when I say the following word, I want to know what you think of it. Therapy.
Misunderstood.
Why?
Because people think it's a solution to problems when it could just cause more problems. So it's
talking about issues over and over makes the issue become alive again.
Yeah, it revisits the thing. And sometimes people don't know how to deal with the people you're talking to, the therapist perhaps, let's say, they don't know how to actually let you vent properly. They just want details and details and details. And so, yes, it's good to recap all the details, but sometimes it's good to just keep certain things inside, right? Certain things weren't your problem. The problem with too many details, if you lose sight of where those details came from, you could take the blame for things that weren't yours. And yesterday is an example. And I was kicking myself because when I took that spill off the bike, I was like, man, I picked the route. I picked where we were going. Everything that happens from now on is my fault. So then my buddy's crank arm fell off his bike and I blamed myself. I was like, wow, maybe if we went down this easier route, that crank arm wouldn't have fallen off, right? So, and then my wife's like, hey, not everything is your fault. When you do something and people go with you, they've chosen to go with you and they're doing their thing alongside you, right? And these are similar actions to combat. If I'm with my buddies and one dude makes a decision, I can't necessarily take the blame for all of the decisions he made. Yes, we're in the whole situation together, but his actions are his actions, which sure, they lead to other actions, obviously. But I can't take the blame for all the pieces. I can only take the blame for what was my fault to blame. So recovering that body, smelling the flesh, doing all those things, it was part of a bigger event. It wasn't my fault, but for a long time, until I was ready to process it, we all blamed ourselves. I have friends who to this day blame themselves for that action, and it wasn't our fault.
Did you know the person intimately, the one that you had to pull out of the car that was burning?
Yeah. So his family's still around. They're doing well. I know that my buddies that were there, one buddy specifically, he deals with it the worst. He's got a lot of problems, but it wasn't anybody's fault. That was the game that day. So
When you joined the military, the Army specifically, were you trying to prove to somebody that you could be the best trooper, the best follower, the best leader? Was there someone you read about in the military where you're like, man, I want to be like that person? Or no, did you have no personal aspirations? You just wanted to serve your country?
yes and no. I think inside you start to pick role models, right? I remember the drill sergeants. Some were really lax, some were really tough, some were really cool, some looked like that's the guy you want to be right there, right? And I still remember Drill Sergeant York, and he was that guy. Strong, big dude, super motivational, like eager, good leader. I was like, cool, I want to be like this dude, right? So you start to pick people you want to model your career after once you see good people, right? But going into it, I don't think that I was like, oh, I'm going to be the best soldier. Looking back now, had I had more time, I would have probably chosen different career paths. I probably would have stayed in longer. I would have tried out for the special operations community. But after the combat, I was like, I'm ready to get out. I did my time. I did my stuff. Let's go be a drill sergeant. Let's get out of this role. And the drill sergeant stuff came because of that drill sergeant role model that I had early on. But no real like Alexander the Greats or Napoleon Bonaparte's that I wanted to be some sort of crazy figurehead. It was mostly this place is going to teach me to be even better at doing all the things that the general world wouldn't. It's going to allow me basic training, firearms training, fight training, knife training, all training aspects. And it did. It provided all that training world. So it was more of an experience than it was like following an idol.
Were you a heavy believer as you were back then as you are now?
I've always been. I grew up Roman Catholic, right?
Us too, yeah.
And so that's how we studied. That's how we were. Slowly it shifted. Right? Studied Judaism for a long time. Studied Islam for a long time, and then I went right back to Christianity. It just made sense.
So when you were in the Army, were you practicing Christian, or was that an experimental?
Those
phase?
were my void of. So yes, in the sense that I needed it internally, but I denied it externally. I was tough, no religion. I got this. But internally, I did have that. Like, this is who I am. Again, battling those little inside fights between the physical world, the spiritual world, right? Expectations from the book and what you're actually doing, right? They contradict each other. They're hard to swallow when you're doing it. And then post-military is when I really settled back in, put my foot down, and was like, this is who I am. This is who I'm going to be. If you like it, awesome. Yeah. If you don't, you don't.
The reason why I asked that question is because, like I mentioned in the beginning, I lived, compared to you, a very square life. You know, it was just school. You go to college because people say you go to college for success. You get in a few fights here and there, but nothing serious. And then, you know, boys be boys. And then you get a career, and that's it. The way that you went, you know, especially like me being raised in the church, they always say, what are the commandments? Thou shalt not kill. So, like, for me, it was unfathomable that I would even consider killing somebody, right? Even if it was in self-defense situations. And I spoke to a very popular bishop. His name is Bishop Marmati Emmanuel. Yeah. And so I asked him, is self-defense a sin? Which he said no. And the patriarch of the Assyrian church also said no to me. So when you're person who has a deep-rooted Christian background and you're going into the military, was there any conflictions? It was like, man, I know the Bible says I'm not supposed to kill, but I'm trying to defend my nation, my people. Was there any conflation or conflictions with you while you were serving, or was it straight arrow?
Yes and no. Yes, when you're entering, but once you're in, you're so bombarded with what you have to learn, do, and become that you kind of do put everything a little bit behind on the moral compass code, right? I need to learn these skills. I need to be better at this. I need to prepare. So yes, I put those things behind a little bit in studying, right? It was more, maybe it's not thou shalt not kill, but maybe thou shalt not murder, like not have the intentions to kill somebody, like not plan it, right? Not have that hatred for somebody. And then, the premeditated portion of it where, and again, when early on, I said it, right? The sins against the Father and the sins against the Father's creation, that's what that did to us. We weren't forced. It was by choice, right? Voluntary service to be in the military. So nobody forces you to do anything. You do it all out of your own free will, which is God's design for us, right? Have free will and live your life here. And so back to that early moment where I talked about those two things and feeling unworthy of the kingdom is, while I'm alive, I need to live this very happy life the best that I can, because there's no guarantee of a happy aftermath for somebody like me, right? And I think that's just like my favorite line in the Bible is the thief next to Christ, and he just says, "Remember me." That's it. That's all I have for the Father, is just remember me, and that's it. No favors, no look at what I did. None of that matters. Just remember me, if that's a possibility. So yes, the turmoil was there, hurting people, killing people, destroying property, ruining people's lives. Some people will never have the life that they had before our work in other countries, right? But that's something that each of us carry, I guess.
I mean, war is truly a hideous thing, and we're seeing it last 4 or 5 years now, and I would love to get your perspective on a few things. So first of all, thank you for sharing that perspective. That was great. I really do appreciate that. So, but as a veteran who served in Iraq, and now 20 years plus after from when the war started with the 2003 invasion, and then to when it ended in 2011, 2012-ish, we've seen multiple wars happen now between Russia, Ukraine, Palestine, Israel. And now the narrative has shifted from, we need to go to Iraq. This is for American security and Iraqi freedom, is to liberate the Iraqi people. But then, recent narratives have shifted now to being like, no, it was disguised as a thing with a lot of self-interest for other nations. It was not as truthful as it really was as to why we went there in the first place. And that was a hard pill to swallow for a lot of Americans because they were so supportive of it. Being someone that was there, boots on the ground yourself, and now what we see between the wars happening now, what mistakes are we making today with the wars happening today that we're repeating from 20 years ago?
A lot of it's just rushing in with unnecessary force, in the sense that we're supporting places that don't have America as their best interest. America's just like a sugar daddy. You know what I mean? And that's the current wars, where in Iraq and the Middle East, it was more like we need to get in there so that we can profit from it on our own, right? We'll have some allies here and there, but we're doing this for us, our major gain. Mostly it was an oil-based thing and a currency thing, right? Saddam didn't want to do certain things, and so we made him an enemy, used Kuwait to do that. Stuff that's really tricky. Not off topic, but still part of it. Have you seen the AI renditions of the speeches from Gaddafi, Adolf Hitler?
I've seen the Hitler ones.
Saddam.
Yeah.
And what they're saying.
Yeah, it makes them sound very empathetic and human-like if you convert
very
it to
patriotic
English.
to their nations.
Yeah.
Right? Which is something that we all preach in America. We're patriotic Americans, right? Not justifying any of their actions. People confuse you saying something like, hey, listen to that. It wasn't that bad, with you agreeing with their actions, right?
Mm-hmm,
so like if we listen to this Hitler thing, you're like, wow, those speeches don't sound like what we thought they were saying, right? Even Joe Rogan talked about it. Like, he thought it was just angry rhetoric, kill everyone, but it's actually very fundamental, very nationalist, very like, we want our country to be our country. Mm-hmm. But because you say that sounds normal, reasonable, now you agree with the murder of all these people, right?
Yeah.
And that's not the case. I just want to be better informed. And I think people are afraid to be better informed because it makes you look like you're siding with the actions of those groups, and you're not. I just want to know more, right? So I think the mistakes that we're making is we rush into things too quickly. It's all special interests. It has nothing to do with the general public of any of the nations, right? So I don't think we need to be in certain places.
Yeah.
But that's just a personal opinion. I don't know how much that has any weight. The idea that we're going to send troops to fight other people's wars, nobody's ever sent anybody to support us the way we support others. Maybe we should sit back and see who wants to support us by going to do some of our bidding without us. Like, hey, you go do that if you think that's important.
Did you ever feel any of that when you were deployed? You're like, why am I here? Like, why are they sending us out to do these things?
Man, I was 100% all in.
All in. Yeah, for sure.
Every part of me was there to serve the great nation of the United States. Yeah.
Beautiful. The possibility of World War III doesn't seem too far off edge at that point. So let me ask you this. If America was to have a draft today with today's society and the way that our generations are being brought up in this culture, let's say, how do you think that our American boys and girls being drafted today would do in a military fight?
The answer I think most people would give would be like, oh no, we're doomed, or we're kind of like falling behind. I think there's still good leadership that knows how to draw out the best in people, right? And so that's what leadership does. If we have a group of 20 dudes, the dude in charge of those guys, his sole job is to figure out how to motivate each one of them and then put them in their little categories, and now you have your groups and you motivate each group the way they're supposed to be motivated, right? So people are motivated very differently. Some people like negative reinforcement. You're a shitbag, you're doing horrible, go be better. And you're like, yeah, I need to be better, right? And then you have people that you need to give them attaboys. Like, hey, good work, my man, keep going. Oh, cool, I'm going to keep going. Then you have the, I don't need much, just a look. Right. You give them a look, and they're like, all right, I'll be here for 100 more days doing
their
whatever
own
you
love
ask.
language. Yeah.
Each person has their own leadership language, essentially. And with good leadership, even if the people aren't great as a general statement, you can you can create groups out of those giant categories of people where it's like, all right, well, these are our hard chargers. Let's use these guys to motivate these guys with a little bit of this. And I think with good leadership, we can make even our current society capable of being good fighters, but it's going to require strong leadership. And I think if they remove the leadership portions of the military, the follow orders guys, the troopers, they're going to have a hard time dealing with it.
For sure. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
But I would go. I'd go back.
You'd be a leader?
Yeah.
You'd be one
I'd
of
go
the
back
commanders?
to do whatever. If the country was at risk, and all of my friends laugh about it, we all say the same thing. We'll go back. It was like, we'll go.
You have a son now, right?
I have 2 sons.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Does that not play a factor for you?
What?
Do you not worry about not being there for them in their time of aging?
I mean, of course you worry about those things. But again, it's one of those things where the whole of humanity is at stake. And so I don't want to not be there, right? I already spent time away from my first son that I feel like I did a disservice to his youth by not being there. That now with the new one, I've spent so much time with him that I think up to this point now, he's such a good person because of the time we've had. And so I wish I could have done better with the other one. So if I can do the same for him, the same love and strength, and like, he's a tough little dude for how old he is, right? He can already pedal bikes. He grabs animals, and he doesn't care about certain things that most kids care about. He eats candy off the floor, and people think it's gross, and he doesn't care. He's just like, yeah, whatever, free candy. He's a total boy. Yes, it would suck to leave, but if it means that my experience can help maybe leverage the battles in a good direction, I would be for it. I think a lot of guys that are veterans would definitely be for it.
I would have struggled to understand that perspective if you even spoke to me 6 months ago. But I watched this documentary recently. I highly recommend everybody watch it. It's an old one. I think it was from 2007. It was James Gandolfini, who played Tony Soprano. He interviewed, I think, 20 U.S. Army, different groups of the military, people who have experienced something called their Alive Day, where it's not really, I don't hear it too often now. It was more so a trend back in the day, but it was essentially the day that they got hit, like shot, mortar, RPG, something, and they survived and they were alive to tell the story. So they called that their Alive Day. So he interviewed 20 of those people and they're telling their stories. And I was like, man, they really did pay the ultimate sacrifices where their life will never be the same. Because of those experiences shared, I now have a completely different viewpoint from when you say stuff like that. It's the ultimate sacrifice.
I think, again, it's a personality trait. Some people look at that and they're like, whoa, hardcore. Some people look at that, they're like, no, that's ridiculous.
Right.
Why would you do that? Right. And that's why it's a voluntary service, because you don't necessarily want those people that are like, no, that's not for me, to be doing something that they don't want to do. So you have a better, stronger force by having people that want to be there, that understand the risks, and that they're signing. I mean, I signed up post 9/11, so I knew we were at war. I knew we were going to go do some stuff, and it was all by choice, all by desire. It wasn't forced. It wasn't anything bad. It was like, this is what we're doing now.
Let's move back to something we touched on previously. So according to Jordaine Carney, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, she's a reporter at Politico, in an article written in 2014, which was 3 years after the war ended, so the data was fresh enough to where it was accurate, but it was removed enough from the war where they were able to collect enough data to make good estimates. Quote, although national tracking of veteran suicide rates is unreliable at best, the VA, Veteran Affairs, estimates that 22 veterans commit suicide each day. This means approximately 8,030 veterans kill themselves every year, more than 5,540 of whom are 50 or older. And then from AmericanAddictionCenters.org, they state, quote, in the 20 years between 2001 and 2020, the suicide rates among veterans between the ages of 18 and 34 have increased 95.3%, which is absolutely insane. Why do you think American veterans' rate of suicide increased specifically after the Iraq War? Let's start there.
Are those numbers collected with people that are still in the military, or is it mostly exited the military and they're veterans?
That's a great question, because I could see why it would matter if you kill yourself, or commit suicide if you're on American soil versus still overseas.
Well, not even that. Like, if you're still on the American payroll, if you're still military, right? Because I know there is suicide rates within the military while you're in service, but I think a lot of them happen post. And again, it's I say it and it sounds bad, but it's programming via the military. The military creates this sense of community, this sense of brotherhood, and you wake up every day and you knock on the door next to you and there's your buddy. You knock on this door, there's your buddy. Let's go do some buddy stuff. Let's go do this. We're a team. You're working as units. What happens when you leave the military is there's no, and I'll use myself as an example. When I left, there were no like conversations as to how to go back to being a normal person. How are you going to fit into society? You're not going to have 10 dudes that you can rely on no matter what happens. You're not going to have leadership telling you where to be, what to do, what's next, what's the mission, right? There's no more mission. Mm-hmm. And I think because the Army does such a great job, and I can only speak for the Army, I'm sure the other branches are the same, they do such a great job of making you fall in love with the mission, the purpose, the drive, that when you leave, you're kind of disassociated from it. And if you don't have an ID, you can't even get on base. And nobody cares for the most part that you're a veteran. They'll say it, they're grateful, but no, people just go right back to living their lives. So it doesn't change much, right? It's not this grandiose thing, and it shouldn't be. You should be proud that you served for you. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be like hey, give me free Applebee's. You know what I mean? Right. But what happens is you have this sense of community, camaraderie, brotherhood, mission-based. Everyone's on the same page, and then all of a sudden you're out of the military, and you're at home. And home, the mission, you should learn how to shift focus. The mission is the family, productivity. How can we make this household better? But there's no guidance into that. And I think for some guys, and for me, it took about 5 years where I was still mad and angry and nobody cares. And I was like going through like these mild depression moments. And, I should just go back. And they only cared about me when I was in this whole like internalizing the separation. So it's almost like a giant breakup, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's your late 20s that you experience
later 20s, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just like a giant breakup, like when you have the girl that you think you are in love with forever and you break up and you're so sad for like 2 months, right? And then you have to readjust to life without her. And then you look at the places that you used to go to and you're like, oh, I used to go there with her. It's a very similar thing. So it's a very similar emotion, and it's so grand because the Army's so big and the missions are they're massive, right? Mm-hmm. And you think you're changing the world, so it's grander than you. It's more than even you. So when you separate from that and you have none of that, you're not attached to it anymore. Other dudes go back and they do other careers and they don't have time to answer your phone calls, and they're over here with their family, and you're like, hey, let's go on a boys trip. I got to do this. I got to do this. So now you don't have all that brotherhood, right? And I think the disconnect from there is guys don't know how to turn their home life, their own individual life, into the mission. Like, make your family the mission. Make yourself the leader of that mission. Now you're the general. Now you're Patton now, right? Mm-hmm. You're the leader of these tanks. Let's get it. Let's make the kids better. Let's make them stronger. Let's knock on the neighbor's door and build a relationship with your neighbor. Go for a run with this guy. Open your garage and do some workouts with your across the street neighbor. Build a community. Build a team. Find a new mission. We're all very mission-based because of the military's programming, that if you come out and you don't know how to reset that, and that would be my advice to all veterans leaving, is, man, find a mission, make that mission 100% your next focus, and you'll find that all your energy goes in the positive direction instead of into drugs and trying to forget all that stuff.
That was a perfect transition to exactly what I was going to ask next, which is, it seems that, so you shared that 5-year window, I didn't know that about you, where you did struggle a bit, sounds like, but it sounds like then you found your footing because you then join the Chicago PD and become a narcotics officer, which is not related to, but the sense of of needing to have heightened attention and nature of being on and aware and constant. Like it reminds you of being on the battlefield, I could imagine, because you're going to these dangerous places doing these busts. Do you think that veterans would need to have a similar environment to what they experience in the military, be around guns, or maybe become security guards of some sorts? Like the schools today, there's a lot of shooting, so maybe we could implement positions for former veterans to be security at schools, or such as yourself, where you can do CQB trainings, or somewhere where your skills can translate into the real world. Do you think that would help, or it's not particularly that, it's just having a purpose?
Yes and no. So I think you're onto something there, but it's purpose-based. Everything's purpose-based more than anything, right? So when you leave, there's guys that leave the military and they don't do anything firearms related or fighting related. They go into business and they crush it. They're just great businessmen, or they go back to being the best mechanic their neighborhood has ever seen, and they find a way to make all of their new talents, their new drive, their consistency, their ability to keep pushing through hardship, and they just funnel it into their new career, right? So I don't think that everybody needs to get out and do more military type related work. I think that's just, some dudes aren't as smart or better educated, right? The more educated guys can make it into the business route. Other guys are more tough. They just want to fight. They go into the fighting route, right? They still want to hunt bad guys, but they don't want to travel too far and still come home at night. They become cops or deputies. You can transition into contracting work where you still do some paramilitary style stuff, but the mission is different, right? The mission will never be the same like the mission you had for the government, for the army. So that little piece of knowing how to shift fire on your mission status, that's what's going to help people really transition well. And I think that's the conversation point. Like, hey, man, you're done with this mission. There's a new mission. We need to funnel that energy, that power, that drive into this other thing. So could it be security guards at schools? I think that'd be cool if that's something that person cares about. I don't think some people have too much drive for like the school stuff, especially if they don't have kids. They're kind of like, people's kids, right? And then if you do have kids, you're more willing to protect kids because you know what it would be like to even just imagine losing a child, right?
Absolutely.
So people with kids are very different than people without kids. People who want kids are different than people who would care for kids. Some people don't even want kids, right? And it blows my mind for people that don't want kids, because your bloodline has survived this long for you to just throw it away.